Hi everybody and welcome back to the Monoglot. Today we're going to talk about something that is certainly of interest to me. I'm afraid this is going to be one of these navel-gazing videos where people drone on and on about their own language learning experiences, but hopefully there will be something here of interest for many of you. Certainly those of you who are looking to achieve advanced levels of fluency in one or more of the languages that you study. What I want to do here is address a certain question that occupies me to some extent, mentally some of the time. I've studied two unrelated languages in fact, to reasonably advanced levels of fluency. I'm talking here about Russian and Japanese. I've either already created or I will create videos where I talk about how I learnt those two languages. And I will be touching on that again to some extent in this video, but I would say that my total exposure to Japanese must be about 10,000 hours, perhaps more, because I lived in Japan for about 4 years in total, and once you've lived in a place for 4 years, it's very difficult to add up your total exposure, right? Nonetheless, I'm going to say 10,000 hours for Japanese and probably about 6,500 for Russian. And although I've spent some time in certain Russian-speaking countries, I have never really lived in any Russian-speaking country to any meaningful extent, never had any meaningful amount of social interaction in any Russian-speaking country. That notwithstanding, I would say that my Russian is certainly my spoken Russian, that fraction of the Russian language that I can actively use when I speak Russian is greater, broader, more extensive than that cross-section of the Japanese language that I can use when I speak Japanese, which is a very long-winded way of saying that my Russian is better than my Japanese in most regards. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why that should be the case, despite the fact that my exposure to Japanese is much greater than my exposure to Russian. So 10,000 hours, maybe more, against 6,500. That's a pretty big gap, and you'd certainly expect my Japanese to be better than my Russian, but I don't think it is. Why not? Well, I'm going to list a number of reasons why I think this has worked out the way it has, and hopefully this will be of some interest to people who are strategizing and looking for ways to attain advanced levels of fluency. The first thing I want to address is the idea that perhaps Russian is just a bit easier than Japanese. Maybe that's why I've made progress with it more quickly. Well, okay, there's probably some validity to that. I would say that Japanese is more profoundly alien than Russian is from the point of view of an English speaker. Of course, Russian, being a European language at some level of analysis, is relatively similar to other European languages. But the first thing I want to say is that Russian grammar, and those of you who have ever studied Russian will know exactly what I'm talking about, Russian grammar is horrendously complicated in terms of its morphology. It's noun declensions, it's adjective declensions because all the adjectives change their forms too. It's verb conjugations. There's a lot of bewildering morphology, changing word forms in other words, that you have to learn to get even reasonably competent at Russian. Japanese has its own complex morphology, but it's overwhelmingly regular and predictable. So once you learn how it works, you've got it forever. Russian isn't like that. It takes years and years to absorb all these different forms. There are lots of unpredictabilities, irregularities. You are forever tripping up over your own feet when you try and learn Russian. So I don't think the greater difficulty of Japanese is something that should be stressed too much here. In addition to that, lexically, both languages are pretty damn alien. And with the rate at which the Japanese are absorbing loanwords from English, you could argue that just throwing a few English words randomly into a conversation is going to get you further in Japanese than it is in Russian. So, although I think Japanese on net balance is more difficult than Russian, certainly if you're talking about the writing system, it is nonetheless the case that they are both pretty far out there in terms of their difficulty. And for that reason, I don't think the relative difficulties of those two languages are what allows us to explain the fact that my Japanese is not as good these days as my Russian. Possibility number two is that I'm just a bit rusty with my Japanese, that I haven't done that much of it in the last few years. And there is certainly some truth in that. Of course, if I spoke Japanese more, I would speak it better. But when I speak Japanese, and these days I speak Japanese mainly with my own students, people who are studying Japanese with me in my Japanese lessons, When I can't think of the word for something, when I realize that I don't know how to say something, I realize with this nasty feeling inside that I probably wouldn't have known how to say it back in the day either. I'd say 9 times out of 10, when I just don't know how to say something, it's not something I've forgotten, it's something that I just never knew. So gradual deterioration over time in the quality of my Japanese is probably not what's accounting for the difference. So okay, those factors aren't accounting for the difference, so what is? I'm going to split this down into various sections, but it's all related to deliberate, careful study, attention and practice versus exposure, blind, blundering, random exposure and just hoping to get better over time. The first of those two descriptions is a description of how I've studied Russian, and the second description is a description of approximately 50% of my Japanese studies, but I'll explain that now. In terms of Japanese, I basically studied it for 4 years at university, relatively intensively, and then I spent a few years in total living in Japan. I only really studied Japanese intensively for 3 and a bit years. I took my foot off the gas a little bit in the latter half, let's say, of my final year at university. So you're talking about, say, 3-point-something years of deliberate study, and then a few years, 3-4 years, however you want to count it, of exposure and randomly picking things up as I went along. And I do think that that is at the heart of the problem. In contrast with my Russian, nearly all of the Russian conversation that I've ever done has been online via essentially italki and occasionally language exchange. I've nearly always been speaking Russian in an environment in which I've simply been able to stop and ask people how to say things, in which I've been able to stop and check that I'm saying things correctly. I've nearly always been speaking Russian in that sort of environment. Whereas most of the Japanese conversation that I engaged in, and I engaged in I don't know how many thousands of hours over the years, most of it was real. And the problem with real conversation is that you just can't stop and ask people how to say things. You can't ask for corrections, you can't ask for help, at least not very often. People don't want to help you with things, not because they're nasty, simply because they're trying to have a conversation with you. It's not their job to constantly try and explain things to you. If you put too much pressure on people like that, they won't want to talk to you after a while. There's something incredibly powerful about that immediate, automatic, native level feedback that you can get when you are talking to people whose job it is to some extent to correct you and to help you. Even when I'm talking with people who I basically consider to be friends now because I've spoken to them so often, I'm talking about speaking Russian here, right? I can still just stop and say, did I say that properly? Was my stress in the right place? Did I conjugate that properly? Does that sound natural? Is there a better way of saying that? And the answers are always forthcoming. And I do think that over time that makes an incredible difference to the rate at which you can expect to improve over time.